in, like the loop of his laughter and the loops of his guitar phrases, was stuff that he already had lying around. He prepared them for like stuff, he was trying to like make a composition out of tape loops, which eventually actually Lennon did eventually on the White Album with Revolution 9, right? So Paul McCartney was playing with that kind of stuff back in '66. He just never thought it would, it would be compatible with anything the Beatles were doing. But when, John brought in this song, which was basically, the first thing that they all sort of confronted was the fact that it had no harmony. It was all on one chord, basically.
Right.
There are minute variations because of the orchestral chord that comes in that sort of gives it a suspended kind of vibe. But generally speaking, when they played their instrument, they only strummed on C rather earnestly, as Paul McCartney himself described it.
That's good.
Yes, and to the credit of George Martin and the rest of the production team at Abbey Road, they rolled with it. They did not say, come on, guys, this is
crazy.
This is not a pop song. They decided to go with it. They decided that this, George Martin was, I think, the greatest asset to the Beatles.
Sure.
Not only because of his technical and musical ability to help them realize their ideas, but also because he never told them, this is wrong, this is not going to work. There's maybe one time where he told them this is not going to work, and that's when they put out Hey Jude as a single, and he told them that it was too long. And
famous last words.
Yes, and famously, then John Lennon told him, because he told them that no radio DJs would play it because it's over 3 minutes.
Right.
And John turned around and told him they'll play it because it's us.
Yeah.
And yes, of course, it was I think the best-selling Beatles single ever in their entire career. So.
Not a lot of artists these days could get away with saying something like that.
Yes,
right?
That's true. That's true. That's a thing. Let's take a sip.
Oh yeah, gotta have some coffee, some tea.
Right.
But so the other two elements that I think are really interesting in the track "Tomorrow Never Knows" are the drums and the vocal effect, right?
Yes. Yes, they were looking for any kind. That track set the tone for the experimental, for the experimental tone of the entire album, basically. And, all bets were off. The drumming was like it sounds almost like a drum loop, and many people think that it is a drum loop, but it's not. It's actually basically Ringo playing the beat as he played it. It's very consistent. It's very loopy. In its essence, it's very hypnotic.
Yeah. In
a way, right? There's a tambura that gives an Indian drone throughout the entire tune. Also, like on the C note, that it's like this little box, right? That makes this sound for meditation.
Yeah.
So they use that on the track, and it basically drones on through the entire track.
Yeah, that kind of gives it the messy feel as well, I think.
Yes, and then there's, of course, the vocals from the second part onwards, right? From, like, the second half of the track, Lennon said that he wanted his voice to sound like the Dalai Lama on the top of a mountain. And George Martin famously said, that it's going to be a bit expensive going to Tibet. And then he tasked his engineers to come up with something that would emulate it in the studio, that would give it a different kind of sound. And he specifically said later on that he knew that just drenching it in reverb is not going to satisfy John.
Right.
That is because that's just going to make it sound far.
Right.
And he knew that sound, and that's not the sound that he wanted. He wanted a different sound.
So Jeff Emmerich came up with the sound, right?
Jeff Emmerich came up with the idea of plugging in the microphone through a Leslie speaker.
Yeah. If anybody's not familiar with the Leslie speaker, it's kind of it's an organ amplifier, I guess.
It's a revolving speaker that's
usually used for the Hammond B3
to the Hammond organ. Yeah, the Hammond has like a little knob with which you control the speed of that speaker on the with the left hand while you're playing.
It's a revolving. Maybe this is why the record's called Revolver. It's a it's a revolving speaker that kind of spins inside the cabinet and kind of gives it this kind of wishy, whirling sound, right?
Yeah, no, the record's called Revolver because it revolves. It's a record.
Also a Leslie cabinet.
Yeah,
whatever.
Also a Leslie cabinet. That's true. No, I don't think that they named it after they already recorded it and it was already, and they just had like a brainstorming session and they had a few ideas. They were going to call it Abracadabra at first.
Revolver's a better name.
Yeah, the Revolver's a better name, but so we can be thankful for the fact that Abracadabra was already taken. Somebody's used it, so they decided not to use Abracadabra, and they started thinking of other stuff. And somehow they got to Revolver eventually. I think it was John's idea because they were talking about spinning triangles, and then somehow they got to Revolver from that. But nobody really knows how they got to Revolver. That's to the best of our knowledge, they just came up with it.
Yeah.
But they did not mean the gun. That's for certain. Lennon later commented on it and said specifically that they did not mean the gun.
Good to know.
But I think he probably tongue-in-cheek, he liked the double meaning of the word.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. This is, they named it after the album was finished. Also getting ahead of ourselves, it was, I think it probably would have been just mad, if it was me, I think it would be just ridiculous after having recorded that album to immediately go out on the road and play, rock and roll music and She Loves You on stage every night to thousands of screaming fans without the ability to hear yourself, None of the songs from Revolver were ever performed live. They could not technically do it at that stage, which must have been just all kinds of frustrating. I cannot even imagine how frustrating it probably was to go on the road after they had completed such a momentous album.
Right.
And play... their
Love Me Do.
Love Me Do, their old stuff, which was what they did on their live shows.
Well, nobody had really ever done that before, really, make such a momentous record that couldn't be replicated in a live performance before, really, right? Like,
yes, that's true. That's why
all bands were playing records and then supporting the records. This is a first, and it was only because the Beatles had this kind of stature that no other band at the time or really since have had, Well, I think that one of the most important things about the Beatles and why they have become basically the classical music of the 20th century, right? I think we can say with pretty much certainty by now that, their music, out of the entire catalog of music from the 20th century, their music is the thing that people are going to be talking about 100, 200 years into the future still. Yeah. It's the most universally also acclaimed and also loved music.
Yes.
From the 20th century.
It had the rare... it is the rare occurrence of a band being, at that moment in time, especially when Revolver came out, before, you had all the Zappas and Led Zeppelins and guys come on the scene, and basically, before music became before albums became an art form in themselves.
Right.
When Revolver came in, the entire world of pop music was thinking in singles still. Albums were just collections of songs that you would put your not so good songs on, right? You would just fill them up with the songs that were not good enough to make a single, and that was your album. And Revolver, Rubber Soul was the first one that really felt coherent as a work of art. Brian Wilson famously said about Rubber Soul that when he heard that album, he knew how good a music album could be, and that influenced Pet Sounds, which in turn influenced Sgt. Pepper. A lot of guys say that it influenced Revolver, but not really. They actually heard Pet Sounds when they were already finishing up Revolver. They got an advanced screening of it through their connections to the Beach Boys. Mm-hmm. And they had a listening session that they all attended and heard the entire album back to front.
Sounds like a fun place to be.
Yes, I would have, one of those fly on the wall situations, no doubt about
definitely.
it. But yes, Revolver was basically, still just the Beatles. They were not. They were influenced by a lot of stuff, but it was not pop stuff. They were so far ahead of other pop artists at that particular point in time that I don't think they were like a roadblock for the entire rest of the pop industry to just try to get around. Nobody could touch them. And this album is a great testament to that. It is an album in the sense that it is a very much a flowing work that is very unified and sounds very
cohesive.
It sounds very cohesive and right. And you can listen to it from beginning to end and get an experience. Yeah. Right? Which is, I think, what they were aiming for, because they were into experiences at that point in time, Mostly Lennon and Harrison were, into acid at the time, and a lot of their songs really reflect that kind of trip, starting with Tomorrow Never Knows. But She Said is about an acid trip that they had with Peter Fonda, I think.
Yeah.
Dr.
Robert.
Dr. Robert is about the doctor, who
I was just looking at the back of the record to make sure it wasn't on Sgt. Pepper.
No, Dr. Robert is definitely... Is
I was 95% sure.
Got to Get You Into My Life is McCartney's take.
Yeah,
that's his ode to pot. He wasn't into acid yet at that point, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. Overall, it's a very aggressive album, I feel like. But there's a couple soft songs, I guess the McCartney tunes specifically, that are very poignant and beautiful as well.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Here, There, and Everywhere is I think it's my favorite McCartney song of his entire catalog, and his as well. It could be a jazz standard, that tune. It's so beautiful. It's so simply touching,
Yeah.
And also the way it was recorded was just ridiculously good. But generally speaking, I think that this is the recording in which McCartney had sort of established his persona as a genius songwriter. He definitely had genius creations before that. But when you look at, I think that they sort of grew up one by one, in a way. I think that Lennon's, point in which he decided that his music was going to be his art and not just, his paycheck, was on Rubber Soul. His songs on Rubber Soul, you take Norwegian Wood, you take In My Life, you take The Word, you take, all of those songs. They could not have been on any one of the previous albums. If you look at McCartney's songs on that album, I'm Looking Through You and Michelle, stuff like that. Those are great, great songs. Nothing wrong with those songs. But they could have comfortably been sitting on Help.
Yeah. I see what you're saying.
They were still the old Beatles kinds of songs. And Revolver was the point where McCartney also said, okay, I get this. I get where we're taking this.
Yeah.
We're no longer those kinds of Beatles. We're going to do different kind of stuff. And
then comes
Eleanor Rigby,
yeah.
And For No One, those songs could not have been, categorically, they could not have been on Help.
Yeah.
Those songs, they couldn't even be on Rubber Soul, I think, Those songs, took it even one step further. You know, it was like his like spiritual awakening, let's call it that way, this album, you know.